guys, so today I'm here to film a video that I've been meaning to film for the longest time, and that is the 10 books that I recommend the most and that I almost literally recommend to everybody. So this isn't necessarily my top 10 books of all time, which is a video I did a while back and you can watch down below, although it might have changed slightly, so let me know if you want an updated version of that video. These are just the 10 books that I often find myself gifting, recommending when people ask for book recommendations, and that I think have the widest appeal. So I don't think any book is going to be universally loved, but there's something about these books I think will really endear themselves to a wide readership of different kinds of readers and potentially introduce people to genres that they haven't read or enjoyed in the past. So without further ado, I'm going to jump straight in. All of these books are very different, very random, but I recommend all of them, so please do check them out. First up is Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson. This is a novel, but it is also semi-autobiographical, based on Jeanette Winterson's own experiences of growing up in Northern England in the mid-1900s and coming to terms with her sexuality whilst living in an extremely religious household that does not approve of her sexuality. Jeanette Winterson is a gay woman herself, as is the main character of her book, who is also called Jeanette. However, there are elements of magic realism in this book dotted here and there, more through storytelling and the character's own attempts to relate her own experiences and understand her own experiences than real moments of magic happening in the storyline. In fact, I'd say this is actually one of Jeanette Winterson's most realistic or grounded in reality books. Now, although I think that premise might set you up for a little bit of sadness, a family that rejects a daughter's sexuality, a daughter who has a difficult relationship with her community and her parents, it's actually quite a hopeful book. I didn't feel particularly depressed or sad during this book. I mean, the themes and the experiences really hit me and I felt them, but I didn't feel hopeless at any point during the book. In fact, the character Jeanette just has such a unique perspective and outlook on her life and never really hates herself or internalizes that hatred that her community are trying to enforce on her. She knows who she is and she's just trying to find a way to be that person, and because of that I think it's such a hopeful and empowering book. It's also beautifully written. I love Jeanette Winterson's writing. Again, I know it's not for everybody, but I think as her writing goes, this one is a little bit more accessible and, like I said, grounded in reality, so may be enjoyed by a slightly wider readership. Something completely different, however, is a piece of ancient Greek literature, and I had to mention this here because people are constantly asking me where to start with classical literature, and although I think there's loads of starting points, one of my favourite books, which I also think is incredibly accessible and an excellent place to start, and I have gifted to so many friends because I love it so much, is Daftness and Chloe by Longus. This is an ancient Greek novel, so it's one of the earliest examples of prose fiction that we have, and it follows our protagonists Daftness and Chloe, who are two young people going through that stage in life where they're starting to feel sexual attraction to other people, and in this case one another, and they don't know what to do with these feelings. The book is set in a bucolic landscape. They are a goat herd and a shepherdess respectively, and they've grown up together, but suddenly their feelings for one another are starting to change and they know they want to explore those feelings, but like I said, they don't know how. And because of that, a somewhat comical storyline unfolds. The book itself was part of a tradition of literature where these romance novels were being written in prose by Greek writers, particularly during the Roman Empire. It was a very popular genre during its day, although this is quite a unique example and quite different in many ways to the genre, and like I said, I think is very accessible. Anyone can read it and enjoy the levity and fun of it, but equally I think if you read a little bit more in depth about it, then you'll realise that it's quite a subversive and unique novel. So it's got a lot to offer both those interested in history and classical literature, but also it's just a light-hearted fun novel for those looking to read something a little bit older and are perhaps feeling a little bit intimidated by reading historical or classical literature. Another book I adored when I first read it and mentioned a lot on my channel at the time, but feel like it's been a hot minute since I talked about it, so I'm glad to recommend it again, is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. So this is a book set in 1980s Nigeria during a time of political upheaval, which is the backdrop of the story, but it's very much the backdrop. We touch on what was going on in Nigeria at the time, but the book focuses on our protagonist, a grown woman whose husband has decided to take a second wife. So this is common amongst their people at the time in their community. However, they had decided to have a monogamous relationship, and his decision to take a second wife comes as quite a shock. The reason for this decision is because they failed to have a child together up until this point, and his family are putting a lot of pressure on him to find a wife who can bear him a child. And it's about the relationship between this husband and wife, their struggles with fertility, with parenthood, their desires for their future, and the lies that are between them. I think the premise itself sounds quite straightforward and like you know where it's going to go, but what I can tell you is that it is full of twists and turns. One of the things that really captured my imagination about this book is that it never went in the direction I was expecting it to. I constantly thought I knew what was happening, and then as soon as I felt comfortable, something new would come into these characters' lives and set it twisting and turning, and because of that it was such a fascinating, captivating read, and I absolutely loved learning about these characters and their situation and what they were going through. But it wouldn't be a June video if I didn't mention a fantasy novel, and of course the fantasy novel I'm going to mention is Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. Not only is this one of my favourite fantasy novels, fantasy series, it's the first in the Seven Waters series, and I mention it all the time in fantasy related videos, but I actually think it's a great fantasy book for people who don't necessarily read a lot of fantasy. I think it will appeal to historical fiction readers as well as literary fiction readers, because it is this beautiful, slow burn story about a young girl living in medieval rural Ireland whose family suffers a curse at the hands of a sorceress, and this protagonist, Sorcha, is tasked with breaking the curse. However, apart from small interactions with the Fae and this curse itself, the book isn't like intensely magical in that it might make people who don't regularly read fantasy uncomfortable and confused. It feels very grounded in history and like a historical novel, but with these beautiful fantasy elements woven in there, if that makes sense. And actually I think that's even more true of some of the later books in the series, particularly book 2, which feels even less fantastical, but always magical, always intriguing to follow, and each book in this series, including Daughter of the Forest, always has a really strong female protagonist who you can really get behind, who you fall in love with and want the best for, but are never sure that it's going to work out for. I felt on edge, anxious throughout reading this book, and like I could not put it down because otherwise I would just be panicking about the future of Sorcha and her family. There is a romance, but it's definitely a slow burn romance. It takes a while to be introduced to the storyline. More than anything else, I feel like this book is about Sorcha and her growth as a young woman. And Juliet Marillier's writing is particularly beautiful, and the way that she paints the medieval Irish landscape is gorgeous. I'm enjoying jumping around to very different books, so next I'm going to mention Convenience Store Women by Sayaka Murata. This is a Japanese novella, which of course I read in English, and it is such a unique, quirky little book that took me by surprise. It follows our protagonist, who is a woman in her 30s working in a convenience store. She's been working there since college, but now that she's a little bit older, people just cannot understand why she still works there part-time. Like, why hasn't she got a career? Why hasn't she got a husband? Why hasn't she pursued the lifestyle that everybody else expects her to do, particularly her family? But our protagonist just isn't interested in the same things as people think she should be. She finds it difficult to relate to other people's emotions, and she just wants regularity, consistency and reliability in her life, and she likes the systematic nature of working in the convenience store and what it brings to her life. However, because people find it difficult to compute her choices, she wants to make them feel comfortable and decides to go down some paths in this novel that she might not have done necessarily. She has a really interesting perspective on the world, one that I don't necessarily relate to myself, but could empathise with because the author did such a fantastic job of allowing me insight into this protagonist's mind and experiences and thoughts. I loved the way this book was written. I loved the main character. It's quite a quiet book, nothing incredibly dramatic happens, but in the best possible way, and I really hope more of this author's books are translated into English in the future because I would love, love, love to read them. I've mentioned fantasy, but I haven't mentioned science fiction yet, so that's where we're going to go next, with Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. This is another SFF book that very much, for me, feels more like historical fiction and will appeal to a lot of different readers, whether they be literary fiction, science fiction, historical fiction, mystery readers. I don't know, like I just think this one has so much to offer. so many different readers, and it is a bit of a modern classic for a reason. Our protagonist is a black woman living in 1970s America in an interracial relationship who out of absolutely nowhere time travels back to the antebellum South during the height of slavery to a slave plantation, and she travels back in order to save the life of this little boy, and then as soon as she's done that, she seems to go back to her time. However, a few years later, she's chucked back into the past, and she keeps doing this for different lengths of time, having absolutely no control over it. Now, of course, being a black woman, travelling back to the antebellum South is particularly dangerous for her, and she has to then take on the role of a slave on this plantation the longer that she stays there, as some of these time travel periods seem to last for months. And in order to survive, she has to take on this role that she never saw herself as having to live through, and one that she thought perhaps that she fully understood, but develops a new perspective on the actions of slaves themselves having to fill that role, if that makes sense. I think it's such an interesting book because it gives you a perspective on the past from a more modern character. I mean, it's the 70s when this book was written, so it's obviously still a little bit historical in that sense for a modern reader, so you've got three perspectives almost as a 21st century reader. But I think it really makes you confront what you think you know about slave experiences, and it is essentially historical fiction. Like, apart from that time travel element and the fact that our protagonist is a 20th century woman, most of this book is set in the 1800s, and it's such an in-depth, harrowing but informative perspective on that time period. So clever, so well written. I need to read more about Octavia E. Butler because she comes so highly recommended, and this is not the only science fiction book by her that I think sounds brilliant, but I think it is one that most people will get something from. But to demonstrate the diversity of science fiction, I'm going to stick with that genre for a moment. So allow me to recommend to you The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Okay, this book is a little bit of a Marmite. I don't think everybody's going to love this book, but I always recommend everybody try this book and have, again, like I said, gifted it to or recommending it to so many different people. It is a comical science fiction novel where our protagonist, Arthur Dent, is an ordinary human man whose best friend, it turns out, is actually an alien, and more aliens are coming to demolish the Earth in order to build a hyperspace bypass, and his friend Ford Prefect, this alien who he thought was a human, helps him escape this impending destruction of the Earth by hitchhiking a ride on the Vogon constructor fleet who are about to knock it down his planet. I hope that made sense, but to be honest, the books don't make a lot of sense, so it probably gives you an accurate idea of what you're getting yourself in for. They are so witty, they are so clever, and they are classics for a reason. I think in particular if you're somebody who thinks of science fiction as Star Trek and intense intergalactic relationships and war and that kind of stuff, you might find that there is something in science fiction for you if you read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because it is simply hilarious. And when my ex read this book, he did mention that he found it a little bit too light and not serious enough, and like it wasn't making enough comments on society. But this is not a serious book, so be pre-warned before jumping into it, and even still I would recommend it to everyone, if simply for the fact that you will get so many like weird SFF pop culture references once you've read it. But if you do want something a little bit more serious, then my next recommendation is Chavs by Owen Jones. Owen Jones is a British political journalist who, if you're looking to get a flavour for, has a YouTube channel, so I will link it down below. But he has written 2 books so far, with a 3rd book coming out shortly, or maybe it's already come out. It's like this month I think it comes out, and I'm so excited for it. But I've read his other 2 books and they are genuinely 2 of the best non-fiction books I've ever read, particularly Chavs. It was written a few years ago, but it's still so relevant. If anything, it's more relevant, and I know a more recent edition has been published with a new foreword by Owen Jones himself, and I wish more people would read this book because it is all about the demonisation of the working class and this caricature of the chav. So if you're not from Britain, you might not know that chav is a derogatory word to refer to people that seem to encapsulate a certain different image of the working class. But it is used by society and the media to perpetuate this image and to denigrate the working class and to create further divisions amongst people, and it's so disturbing. This book tackles classism and the awful stereotypes that lead people to judge one another, as well as blame those that perhaps don't have as much in life for their situation. Instead of looking at society's issues and problems and how they lead to people being in worse off circumstances, I think it's so easy still for people to casually use words like chav or other words that are derogatory towards working classes to perpetuate classist stereotypes, even if they seem to be so woke in other areas of life, if that makes sense. Like, I think it's still something that there's a massive issue with, and in fact seems to be rising its ugly head of late, and therefore I really want more people to read this book. And although it focuses in on Britain, I think it applies to an attitude that exists elsewhere, even if the word doesn't necessarily exist elsewhere. But the reason I also recommend this is because it's very accessible. I think Owen Jones writes excellent, accessible political journalism that can be read by anybody. Two more books, and the next one is one that I actually read many years ago and have since read multiple times and continue to recommend to everybody in my life, which is The Penelope by Margaret Atwood. This was the first Greek myth retelling that I ever read, and I actually read it before I ever read any ancient Greek literature itself. This is a retelling of the Odyssey by Homer, which is an ancient Greek epic poem following the adventures of Odysseus after the Trojan War on his journey home to Ithaca and his queen Penelope. However, in this story, Margaret Atwood explores Penelope's perspective, what she is experiencing and her thoughts from her home in Ithaca whilst she's waiting for Odysseus to return, unsure if he ever will. Like I mentioned, I read this before I read the Odyssey, so I think you can read it before you read the Odyssey. I know sometimes people ask me that. If anything, I think these kind of books are an excellent introduction to ancient Greek literature and history because they may spark a further interest in you. And if you've already read the Odyssey, I think it might give you a new perspective on that story. It's very short, it's a very quick read, but for being so few pages, it makes a massive impact, and I absolutely adore it. Last but not least, however, is probably the most recent book to make it onto this list, and that is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. I only read this book this year, but I've already recommended it to so many people, and as soon as I read it I couldn't believe how long it had taken me to read it, so please do go check it out if you've been meaning to. It is a kind of literary mystery, I would describe it, although I think the term literary can sometimes seem a little bit inaccessible to people, so don't let that put you off this book because I don't think this book is in any way inaccessible. What I mean by literary generally for me is that it's just really beautifully written, and this story in particularly is incredibly well crafted. Like, this is a masterful work of craftsmanship or craftwomanship. We follow a woman in her 30s who has grown up in her father's antiquarian bookshop and now is an amateur biographer in her spare time whilst working in this bookshop. She is contacted by this famous author who nobody really knows anything about because she constantly tells the press different stories about her upbringing, but now that she's a certain age, she wants to tell the real story, and she has decided to ask this woman to be her biographer completely out of the blue. So our protagonist travels to this woman's house in order to take notes on her story and learn the history of this author's life. We then flip between the two time periods of our protagonist writing this biography and getting to know this older woman and searching for the answers to some of her questions, as well as the past in which this woman lived. She grew up in a wealthy manor house as part of a family that had lots of secrets and was perceived as a little bit strange by the outside world. I mean, they were a little bit strange, I think that's fair to say. And we go as far back as the generation previous to this author and the history of this house and this family. And it's so intriguing and mysterious and a little bit dark, but completely compelling throughout, and I absolutely loved it. I've mentioned it a few times this year because it is quite a recent read for me, but I definitely think it deserves to be on this list. But those are the 10 books that I probably recommend the most often and would recommend to the most people. Let me know if you've read any of these. Did you enjoy them? It's okay if you don't. I don't really expect everyone to love them, but are you interested in reading any of them if you haven't? Because I would encourage you to at least give them a try. I'd also love to know what book you recommend most often and to the most people, but until next time, happy reading and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!